In his book, Sacrifice Zones, The Front Lines of Toxic Chemical Exposure in the United States, Steve Lerner provides a disturbing account of 12 fence-lined communities adjacent to some of the nation's most hazardous industrial and military sites, neighborhoods with toxic groundwater contaminated by high-tech weapons plant, a community next to a 60-foot pile of excavated sludge dubbed Mount Dioxin, a charcoal plant that leaves residents inhaling lighter fluid fumes with each breath, a community where millions of gallons of oil have leaked into the ground, and others. The individuals who live in these sacrifice zones experience elevated rates of respiratory disease, cancer, reproductive disorders, birth defects, learning disabilities, psychiatric disorders, and early death. Steve Lerner uncovers an environmental and a public health crisis of unnerving proportion, but also that the burden of living in sacrifice zones falls disproportionately on people of color and low-income Americans. They experience a brand of environmental racism and find not only the perpetrators, but the government agencies that are supposed to be helping these individuals are failing to acknowledge fully the damage being done. Mr. Lerner allows fence-line residents to speak in their own words through the hundreds of interviews that he's conducted. The result is an unforgettable series of case studies, not about victims, but about accidental activists who struggle against great odds on behalf of their families and their communities. Among the aims of the Lillian Smith Book Awards jury is to expand the readership of important books, works that, in the spirit of Lillian Smith, are deeply relevant to the pursuit of social justice. Such, we believe, is the case for Steve Lerner's book, a work that should be read by all concerned with our environment, racial and economic justice, and public health. Steve, it's my pleasure to present to you the Lillian Smith Book Award.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to receive this award and to share it with Danielle McGuire, whose work I admire very much. Across the nation, in thousands of low-income communities, a disproportionate number of African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans are exposed to toxic chemicals from heavily polluting industries and military bases located next door. Contamination in these mixed residential industrial zones is more intense than in white and affluent communities. As a predictable result, the number of environmentally induced diseases and premature deaths in these hotspots of pollution is disproportionately high. I'd like to tell you a few stories from the research I did for this book. I started out in a community in Louisiana, 25 miles to the west of New Orleans, called Diamond, Louisiana. And in Diamond was a community that went back to slave days. It was, in fact, the epicenter of one of the largest slave revolts in the history of the United States. And the slaves on the Trepanier plantation there rose up and marched on New Orleans to essentially end the era of slavery. They were premature and they were wiped out, and many of them were executed or tortured, and the revolt was put down. The descendants of those slaves stayed on the land, and they farmed the land until 1911, when Shell Oil moved ashore to create competition with Standard Oil and to essentially bring competition to the burgeoning oil market in the United States. In the process of setting up their refinery, they pushed the descendants of these former slaves off their arable land and sandwiched them between the refinery and a chemical plant that they erected in 1953. They could pushed these people off the land because the residents of Diamond didn't have papers showing that they owned the land. They had just always lived there. So come the 1950s and 1960s, you have this small population that is living right next door to these heavily polluting plants. Just to give you an idea what life was like there, the emissions from the plants were so intense that, particularly at night, they had to close the doors and windows and turn off the air conditioners, and sometimes get in the bathtub, wet a towel, and put it over their head in order to escape the fumes from the plant next door. Everyone knew there that their health was being compromised by the emissions from Shell oil and Shell chemical, but they were stuck in a toxic trap. The emissions had reduced the value of their homes so much that they couldn't sell them and afford to move to safer ground. And besides, they didn't want to abandon their relatives and friends who couldn't afford to move. So they stayed there. In the 1970s, Leroy Jones, one of the residents of Diamond, a 16-year-old boy, was mowing the lawn, or was preparing to mow the lawn outside his grandmother's house. Two of his friends were passing on bicycles, and they stopped briefly. After Leroy finished talking to them and they rode off, he leaned over to pull the cord on his lawnmower, and a spark from the engine ignited gas which had leaked out of the chemical plant next door, and he burst into flames. The house behind him that his grandmother lived in also was engulfed in flames. She died immediately. Leroy Jones took a day to die in the hospital. About 10 years later, there was another huge industrial accident at the refinery. One of the catalytic cracking plants there burst into flames, exploded. 8 workers were killed, 40 were injured in the neighborhood, and there was large damage to property, and the town had to be evacuated. Following this, residents got together and they decided enough was enough. Margie Richard, who taught school there, began organizing around town with her neighbors. She was not able to allow her students out of the classrooms to exercise because fumes from the plant were so intense. Over a 10-year struggle, she lobbied Shell to buy out the homes of the residents in Diamond. And eventually she won this struggle against one of the largest corporations in the world. She was able to do this through a media campaign that essentially embarrassed Shell officials into agreeing to buy out the homes. But this environmental justice victory was a bittersweet victory because essentially it destroyed this African-American community that went back to slave days. In the course of writing the book, Diamond, A Struggle for Environmental Justice in Louisiana's Chemical Corridor, I heard about many other communities around the country that were suffering similar problems. And I'd take notes and made a list of other places I heard about. So for my next project, I decided to single out a dozen case studies around the country of other communities that were less famous than the case in Diamond, but nevertheless were experiencing the same kind of problems. So I want to tell you one more story from the Sacrifice Zones book. And that's about a woman named Laura Ward, who lived in Tallahassee, Florida, a small African-American community south of Tampa. And Laura Ward was sitting in her kitchen one morning, and she looked out the window, and here was a crew of hard hats with a drilling rig pulling up onto her lawn. And not a shy woman, she ran across the lawn and confronted the crew boss and said, "What are you doing?" And he said, oh, we're drilling a test well here to see if any of the contaminants from the neighboring factory here, the Lockheed Martin weapons facility here, have gotten into the shallow aquifer and leaked underneath your home and the home of your neighbors. Laura Ward told me that it was at that moment that she felt the earth shift beneath her, because she knew that she and her neighbors had been drawing their drinking water out of this shallow aquifer. The water that they used to drink, to make baby formula, to cook their food, to bathe in, was turning out to be contaminated. So she got together with a neighbor friend, Wanda Washington, and they began to educate themselves. They said they became conversant about all of the details of what Lockheed Martin had been leaking out of their facility, the regulations surrounding what was permitted, and the history in which the health officials had actually known about this problem for a number of years, but had not told members of the community because they didn't want to create a panic. So Laura Ward continued to follow this case and to publicize it and to organize her neighbors through the two churches in town and to make a stink about it. But unlike in Diamond, there was no clear resolution of this. The neighbors were not bought out. They continue to this day to live on the land there. There is a lawsuit that is going on. I'd like to step back a minute from these two anecdotal stories about people who live on the fence line with heavy pollution in these hot spots of contamination and look at whether there are things that we could be doing to do something about this. And there are a number of ideas. One of them is that we should create buffer zones around these hotspots of pollution. We should require that industry buy out people in neighborhoods where they cannot protect them from illegal emissions. Second, we should begin to require our regulatory agencies to strictly enforce existing laws. The fact is that in many of these areas, this kind of illegal pollution goes on for decades. We should require that there be higher fines so that industries are not able to simply pay the fine as a cost of doing business and continue on. We have to change the laws because the laws that currently exist make it very difficult to show that the release of a chemical at point A caused a disease right across the fence line in the residential neighborhood. There are many things we should be doing to begin to address this pattern of environmental injustice across the country. Unfortunately, this is unlikely to happen unless we begin to assemble the political will to do this. And this will only happen if there's a real coalition built to address this pressing civil rights issue. A first step toward that would be if the Big Ten environmental groups began to provide technical, financial support, organizing techniques, media campaigns, and so on, with people who are on the fence line with heavy industry, with these environmental justice groups. That would serve two goals. Number one, it would give much needed support to these small groups of environmental justice activists who feel they're working alone. But from the side of the big environmental groups, it would also begin to make them more diverse, both economically and racially. It would be important if religious organizations, civil rights groups, labor groups began to join this coalition and to say, enough is enough. We are taught that in this country, all Americans should be equally protected under the law. I'm here to tell you that, in fact, on the ground, in these vulnerable communities, that's not taking place. and this continues to happen on our watch. It's time for us to stand up and say, no, we're not going to allow this to happen anymore. I'd like to end by thanking the Lillian Smith Book Award for this wonderful recognition of this work, and to say that I hope that it will help provide many people around the country more awareness about this pressing social issue. Thank you.